The courtroom was silent when the lie was spoken.
I'm not reaching.
He lunged at me. Officer Dana Whitaker declared her hand resting on the Bible like the truth itself. The jurors leaned forward. The district attorney nodded with confidence, and the man sitting at the defense table, Caleb Ward, didn't so much as blink. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He just looked at her calm as still water, as if he already knew how this story would end. But what no one in that Boston courtroom realized, not the prosecutor, not the officer, not even the judge, was that the quiet black man they were accusing wasn't just another defendant. He was something far more dangerous to a lie. A decorated FBI special agent who had spent 2 decades exposing corruption exactly like this. And now, he was about to do it again. If you've ever wondered how far one person's courage can go when the system turns against them, stay with me, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about truth, power, and justice. Drop a comment if you believe no one, no matter their badge, should ever be above the truth. Officer Whitaker's voice carried the confidence of someone who had been believed her entire career. 14 years on the Boston Force Zero, sustained complaints, and 2 commendations framed in her precinct office. She was the kind of cop prosecutors loved to put on the stand, tall, crisp uniform eyes that never trembled. Her testimony painted a familiar picture: a late-night traffic stop near the Zakim Bridge, a swerving vehicle, a non-compliant driver who turned aggressive. Every word was rehearsed, every pause calculated to sound reluctant, yet brave. And the jury was eating it up. The district attorney, Paul Mercer, built the story like a monument. This officer did her duty, he told them. She followed protocol. She feared for her life. It was the oldest script in law enforcement, and it always worked until it didn't. Sitting at the defense table, Caleb Ward listened with a patience that made people uneasy. There was no outrage on his face, no plea for sympathy, just focus, controlled breathing, a gaze that seemed to weigh every syllable that left Whitaker's mouth. When Mercer rested his case, the courtroom seemed to exhale. Everyone expected the defense to crumble. After all, who would the jury believe, a decorated officer or a middle-aged black man accused of assaulting her during a routine stop? But when defense attorney Maya Benton rose to cross-examine, her tone was almost conversational. She didn't argue. She asked questions, soft surgical questions that began cutting at the edges of Whitaker's certainty. Where exactly did the defendant's right hand go? Which side of the car was she standing on? Was she sure about the sequence of events? It didn't take long before the officer's confidence began to shift one nervous breath at a time. Then came the detail, the kind that changes everything. "Your body camera," Maya said, flipping a page on her legal pad. "It malfunctioned, correct?" Whitaker nodded. "How often has that happened in your 14 years? The pause that followed was louder than any answer she could give. The jurors started writing. Mercer frowned. Whitaker's fingers tightened on the witness stand just slightly enough for Caleb to notice. He saw it the way a trained man sees a tell, because that's exactly what he was trained for. When Maya sat down, the room felt heavier. The judge called a short recess. The jurors whispered. Whitaker stared at the table, suddenly aware of how hot the courtroom had become. But when the session resumed, the defense dropped the first quiet bombshell. Caleb Ward was taking the stand in his own defense. No lawyer would have advised it, but he insisted. He stood with quiet confidence, hands steady as he took the oath. His voice was calm, articulate, the kind of tone that carried authority without demanding it. Mr. Ward, Maya began, "You said earlier you recorded part of your interaction with Officer Whitaker." Why he looked at her then, at the jury. Because this wasn't the first time I'd been pulled over by the same officer. And patterns, he said carefully, are something I pay attention to. That was the first moment the room truly listened. Something in the way he said it, measured, professional, precise, didn't match the image of a reckless driver or a violent suspect. It matched something else entirely. A man trained to notice behavior. A man who had seen lies collapse before. Maya pressed play on a small speaker. The audio filled the courtroom, the chirp of police sirens, Whitaker's voice sharp with command, Caleb's voice calm, almost gentle. "Officer, may I know the reason for the stop?" he asked. "You were swerving." "Get out now," she replied. No threats, no resistance, no slurred words, just the sound of an officer escalating and a citizen trying to stay composed. By the time the clip ended, you could feel the temperature drop. The DA shifted uncomfortably. The jurors looked at each other. And Officer Whitaker, she looked like she'd just seen a ghost. What no one knew then, not even Maya, was that the calm man at the stand wasn't just another defendant with a recording. He was a man who had spent 22 years as an FBI special agent specializing in public corruption. And this trial, this single courtroom drama, was about to unravel something much bigger than one false arrest. Because when truth faces power, one of them always breaks first. And this time, it wouldn't be him. When the audio stopped playing, the silence inside the Suffolk County courtroom was almost reverent. You could hear the faint hum of the heating system and the soft shuffle of a reporter's notebook closing. Judge Eleanor Park leaned forward, elbows on the bench, her face unreadable, but her eyes sharp. The jurors looked stunned, half disbelief, half realization. The version of events they had been fed for hours was now cracking in real time. And in the middle of it all sat Officer Dana Whitaker, her hands folded tightly on the table, a pulse jumping just beneath her jaw. District Attorney Paul Mercer rose first, a man trying to reclaim a battlefield he'd just lost. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice steady, but thinner now, "a recording is just one angle of a larger event. Audio doesn't show what happens outside the frame." He was right technically, but his tone carried that faint tremor that told everyone in the room he was fighting uphill. He looked toward the jury, appealing to reason, to loyalty, to something familiar. Officer Whitaker feared for her safety. She acted in good faith. Caleb Ward sat still, listening, eyes level with the prosecutor. He didn't flinch when Mercer used the word feared. He'd heard it before too many times in too many reports, attached to too many names that didn't survive the explanation. His breathing remained steady, his hands motionless, a man built for stillness. You could almost sense he was waiting not for mercy, but for accuracy. When Mercer finished, the judge turned to the defense. "Ms. Benton, you may proceed." Defense attorney Maya Benton stood, her expression a mix of composure and controlled electricity. "Your Honor," she began, "the defense would like to supplement the audio recording with visual evidence, specifically footage captured from a nearby garage camera on North Street, time-stamped 9:12 p.m., April 8th. Mercer started to object, but stopped halfway through the motion. He already knew he'd lose, admitted Judge Park said curtly. The lights dimmed again, and the projector flickered to life. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. A silver sedan pulls to the curb. Seconds later, a patrol car stops behind it. The officer exits Whitaker, hand already on her hip holster. The driver steps out slowly, palms visible. No lunge, no aggression, no threat, just calm compliance. The moment that supposedly turned violent looked more like a man surrendering to a narrative written before he even left the car. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the projector. When the video ended, no one breathed for several seconds. Then Maya's voice broke the quiet. Your Honor, the defense would like to call Officer Whitaker back to the stand for clarification. Whitaker rose slowly, her once crisp movements replaced by something hesitant. Her uniform, perfectly pressed that morning, now looked like armor that didn't fit. She swore again, took her seat, and avoided everyone's eyes, but the judge's. Officer Whitaker Maya began, You've testified that your body camera malfunctioned during this incident, correct? Yes, Whitaker said softly. And yet, we have here a recording from a garage camera less than 50 feet away. Were you aware that this area was under surveillance? No. Is it standard procedure in your 14 years to check for additional footage when your own recording fails? I suppose it could be, she said, shifting in her chair. Maya nodded. Could be or should be, Mercer stood. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Park waved him off. Overruled. Answer the question, officer. Whitaker's voice wavered slightly. It should be. Thank you, Maya said, her tone polite but cutting. Now, in your initial report, you stated the defendant, Mr. Ward, lunged toward your firearm. Would you like to clarify that statement in light of the video we just saw? Whitaker's lips parted, then pressed together again. Her throat moved as she swallowed. It happened fast. Maybe I misinterpreted his movement. You misinterpreted a man standing still. Maya asked, her tone surgical. Would you like the jury to replay that section? Mercer stood again. Objection harassment. Judge Park's voice was firm. The officer will answer. Whitaker's voice was quieter now. No, that won't be necessary. Maya stepped closer, her presence deliberate, but not aggressive. Officer Whitaker, has your body camera ever malfunctioned before during any other use of force incident? Whitaker blinked. A few times. How many I don't recall. More than once. Yes. More than 5. A pause. Maybe. Maya raised her eyebrows slightly, letting the silence do the rest. The jury was watching every twitch of Whitaker's jaw, every tremor in her voice. The image of a flawless officer was fading fast. Your Honor, Maya said the defense would like to introduce internal maintenance reports from the Boston Police Department's Technical Division. These records show that Officer Whitaker's body camera experienced repeated manual override failures in plain English deactivations that required manual input. Mercer's hand slammed onto the table. Your Honor, this is speculative, it's documented. Maya interrupted and time-stamped, including the night in question. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Park called for order, her gavel striking once-twice. Proceed. Maya approached the witness. Officer Whitaker, can you explain how your body camera was manually turned off at 9:11 p.m.? The exact minute Mr. Ward pulled over Whitaker's face drained of color. I don't recall turning it off. Maya tilted her head. Maybe it was instinct. Mercer stood again, shouting objection. But it didn't matter anymore. The jury had already seen enough. The once impenetrable wall of authority around Whitaker was cracking like glass. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a story, unraveling itself. Caleb sat quietly, watching it all unfold, with a strange mix of sadness and inevitability. He'd seen this pattern before arrogance denial exposure. It was never satisfying. It was just necessary. He glanced at Maya, who nodded almost imperceptibly. They both knew they had more. The audio, the video, it was just the beginning. The deeper evidence was waiting locked away in a file Mercer hadn't seen yet. Judge Park called for a 15-minute recess. Whitaker stepped down, looking dazed, while Mercer leaned in close, whispering something urgent. She didn't respond. Reporters rushed into the hallway to phone their editors. The story had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Maya turned to her client. "They'll try to recover," she said quietly. "They'll pivot. But they're bleeding now." Caleb nodded once. "It's not about winning," he said softly. "It's about record-keeping." Maya looked at him curiously. "You sound like someone used to writing reports." He didn't answer. He just opened his briefcase and pulled out a small flash drive labeled Field Debrief. Maya stared at it, realization dawning. "Mr. Ward," she whispered, "what exactly do you do for a living?" He met her eyes, calm and direct. "Risk assessment," he said again. But this time, the words carried a different kind of weight. The kind you hear from someone who's lived inside investigations, who knows how to dismantle lies, not with anger, but with evidence. In the corner of the courtroom, Officer Whitaker sat alone, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time in her career, she realized the truth wasn't something she could control. The narrative she'd written had been overwritten line by line, fact by fact, by a man she had underestimated from the moment she saw him. And she had no idea just how much more he had left to reveal. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the air inside the Suffolk County courtroom felt heavier, denser, almost charged. People had stopped whispering by then. Everyone knew something bigger was coming. Judge Eleanor Park took her seat, scanning the faces before her with that look seasoned judges wear when they can feel truth hovering just outside the door. Officer Whitaker sat rigid, avoiding every gaze but her own reflection in the glass of a nearby display screen. And at the defense table, Caleb Ward waited not with anger, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who'd lived long enough to know that patience can be louder than outrage. Maya Benton rose. Her expression carried the kind of confidence that doesn't come from ego, but from evidence. "Your Honor." She began the defense would like to recall the defendant to the stand. There was no objection this time. Mercer, the district attorney, simply leaned back, arms crossed his jaw, set tight as if bracing for impact. Caleb stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and took the stand once more. When he raised his hand to take the oath again, his eyes didn't leave the jury. They searched faces not for pity, but for comprehension. When he sat, Maya approached him carefully, like someone unveiling something fragile but indestructible. "Mr. Ward," she began softly, "yesterday, you told this court that your profession is risk assessment. Would you care to clarify what that means?" Caleb hesitated for half a breath. It means identifying patterns that can lead to harm, he said. Sometimes those patterns involve people, sometimes systems. His tone was calm, factual, almost too calm. The jury leaned forward. "And who employs you for this work?" Maya asked. He looked at her, then at the judge. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation." It was so quiet, the fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder. Mercer blinked twice, as if the words didn't compute. Whitaker froze color, draining from her face. Someone in the gallery let out a gasp that echoed longer than it should have. Maya nodded gently. "You're a federal agent?" "Yes, ma'am. Special Agent Caleb Isaiah Ward, assigned to the Public Integrity Section, Boston Field Office. 22 years of service." The silence broke into murmurs. The bailiff called for order, his voice cracking under the sudden noise. Even Judge Park leaned back, momentarily taken aback, her composure flickering before returning to full form. "Mr. Ward," she said, "for the record, please confirm your credentials." Caleb reached into a slim briefcase beside him and withdrew a small leather wallet. Inside, gleaming under the courtroom lights, was the unmistakable badge and ID of a decorated FBI special agent. Maya took it carefully, handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the clerk. The judge studied it for a long moment, then looked up. "Confirmed," she said quietly. "Please continue, Ms. Benton." Maya turned to the jury. "Mr. Ward, were you on duty the night of April 8th? "No. I was attending a private dinner for a retired agent, but my instincts are rarely off duty. And the recording you made, why keep it hidden until now?" Caleb took a breath, steady but deep. "Because I wasn't just defending myself. I was documenting a pattern that reached further than one officer. I wanted the truth on record before I revealed who I was." The weight of his words settled over the room like smoke. This wasn't about one traffic stop anymore. This was about a man who had seen behind the curtain and had decided to pull it back in the most public way possible. Maya paced slowly, careful not to break the moment. "You said a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Caleb's gaze moved toward Whitaker. "Malfunctions," he said. "Disappearing footage. Identical language in reports written months apart. I'd seen it before in precincts under federal review. I wanted to see if it was happening here too." A ripple went through the jury box. Even the stenographer paused for a split second before catching up. Maya stepped aside. "Your Honor, the defense calls its next witness Special Agent Robert Klein, Internal Affairs, FBI Boston Division." The courtroom doors opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a dark suit entered. He carried a folder thick enough to make Mercer visibly tense. When he took the stand, he swore the oath without hesitation. "Agent Klein," Maya began. "You're familiar with Agent Ward," Very Klein said. "I was his supervising officer for 5 years. And you're aware of his current case assignment?" "Yes." "A joint investigation into falsified police documentation in eastern Massachusetts, including suspicious patterns of evidence loss." The room erupted again. Mercer stood face red. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Overruled." Judge Park said sharply, "You'll let him finish." Klein continued calm as a man describing weather. "Agent Ward volunteered for an undercover assessment after preliminary data suggested irregularities in the body cam systems of select officers. His goal was to collect first-hand evidence. We were preparing to approach the department formally." Maya nodded. "Was Officer Dana Whitaker among those flagged in your internal review?" Klein opened the folder. "Yes." 3 prior incidents of camera failure, each followed by a resisting arrest charge later dismissed for lack of evidence. Whitaker's chair scraped the floor as she shifted, panic flashing across her face. "That's not true," she blurted out, but the judge's gavel struck before she could continue. "You will remain silent until called," Judge Park ordered. Caleb watched her quietly, his expression not of triumph, but of fatigue. He had no joy in the exposure, only relief that the truth finally was breathing in open air. Maya's final question cut through the tension. "Agent Ward, after 22 years investigating corruption, why risk your own reputation by staying silent until today?" Caleb's eyes softened. "Because truth without proof is just noise," he said. "And I've seen too many good people drowned out by noise." He glanced briefly at the jury. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here to remind this system what accountability looks like." When he stepped down, the gallery rose slightly, some out of respect, some out of disbelief. The judge called for a recess, but no one moved for several seconds. People needed to process what they'd just witnessed. The accused turning out to be the investigator, the defendant transforming into the man who had been watching the watchers all along. Outside, the courthouse reporters were already gathering cell phones, raised questions firing like sparks in the cold Boston air. Inside, Officer Whitaker sat alone, staring at her hands, her career, and the fragile distance between truth and the stories we tell to survive it. The next morning, the courthouse didn't feel the same. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones angled toward anyone wearing a suit. Headlines had already begun to spread across Boston FBI agent Expose's false testimony in local police case. Inside, the atmosphere was sharp, almost metallic. You could sense the shift in gravity. For the first time, the badge wasn't enough to silence the truth. Judge Eleanor Park entered briskly and called the session to order. The chatter died instantly. Officer Dana Whitaker sat at the witness table again, her posture brittle, the defiance gone. Her attorney sat beside her, whispering instructions that sounded more like pleas. Across the aisle, District Attorney Paul Mercer looked like a man realizing too late that the case he'd built had turned to dust. "Agent Ward, Judge Park said you remain under oath." "Yes, Your Honor." "Agent Klein," she continued, "you're also recalled to testify." The two men stood side by side, Ward, calm, Klein. Precise, both professionals used to navigating hostile rooms. What followed wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was something quieter, colder, more devastating. Klein laid out the documents, internal memos, technical logs, complaint reports. Each page added a brick to the wall, closing in around Whitaker, and by extension, the department that had protected her. The jurors watched closely now, not as spectators, but as witnesses to a truth unraveling layer by layer. Maya Benton led the questioning. Her voice was steady, clipped, methodical. "Agent Klein, when you say manual override failure, can you explain what that means in plain language for the jury?" "It means the body camera didn't malfunction," Klein said. "It was turned off. By hand. By the officer." "Yes." That single word landed like a gavel. Whitaker shifted in her seat. Her hands, once steady on the stand, now trembled slightly. Mercer objected out of reflex, but the judge barely acknowledged him. The tide had turned. This wasn't about defense strategy anymore. It was about integrity. Maya turned toward Whitaker. "Officer, would you like to respond?" Whitaker hesitated, her throat tight. I was under pressure. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Like what? Maya pressed gently. Whitaker's voice cracked. "I thought he was reaching for something. I panicked. I turned it off to control the narrative. I didn't think anyone would." She stopped, realizing she'd said too much. The courtroom was silent again. There was no satisfaction in the air, no applause, only the weight of consequences catching up to their source. Caleb Ward sat motionless, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't triumphant. He simply looked like a man who had seen this ending before. Judge Park leaned forward. "Officer Whitaker, do you understand the seriousness of what you've just admitted?" Whitaker nodded weakly. "This court will refer your statement to the district attorney's office for perjury review and internal disciplinary proceedings." She nodded again, tears finally breaking through. "Yes, Your Honor." Maya rested her pen and glanced at Caleb. He met her eyes, offering a quiet, almost imperceptible nod. This wasn't victory. It was closure, or maybe the beginning of something larger. When it came time for final remarks, Mercer rose to speak, but the conviction in his voice was gone. "The Commonwealth acknowledges new evidence and withdraws all charges against Mr. Ward," he said flatly. "We will cooperate with any federal review moving forward." Judge Park turned to the jury. "You are dismissed with the court's gratitude. This case is concluded." The sound of the gavel struck once. Just once. It was enough. Outside, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed. As Caleb exited the courthouse, Maya beside him. Questions fired like bullets. "Agent Ward, did you plan this investigation? Was the department under surveillance? What happens next?" He answered none of them. Instead, he paused on the courthouse steps, his gaze sweeping across the city skyline, the hum of Boston traffic echoing below. "This isn't about one officer," he said finally, his voice calm but carrying weight. "It's about how easy it is for the system to forget what justice actually means. We can't fix that overnight, but we can start by telling the truth, even when it costs us something." That evening, the story ran on every major network. The Boston Police Commissioner called for an emergency review of disciplinary protocols. The mayor announced a task force on transparency and accountability. Internal Affairs confirmed an expanded investigation into body cam irregularities. The city, for once, didn't rush to defend itself. It listened. Later that night, Caleb returned to his small apartment overlooking the Charles River. He sat by the window, the city lights flickering on the water. For the first time in years, he let himself exhale. His phone buzzed a message from Agent Klein. "It's done. You did what we couldn't." He didn't reply. He simply looked out at the skyline, the quiet hum of sirens somewhere in the distance, and whispered, "We're not done yet." He knew the cost of truth. He'd seen it in other cities, in other faces. Integrity was rarely rewarded immediately. It demanded patience and sometimes pain. But he also knew this. Once a system is forced to see itself clearly, it can't unsee. And that, he thought, was how real change begins, not in the shouting, but in the silence that follows confession. Winter gave way to a hesitant spring in Boston. The snow melted from the steps of the Suffolk County Courthouse, But the story that began inside those walls didn't fade with the season. It became something else, an inflection point, a ripple spreading outward through a city that could no longer look away. The case of Commonwealth versus Ward had stopped being about one officer's lie. It had become a mirror, and people were finally willing to look. In the months that followed, the fallout was swift and visible. The Boston Police Department announced an overhaul of its body camera system. No more manual controls. No more missing footage. Every recording would be uploaded automatically to an independent cloud monitored by a third-party oversight board. Mayor Hanley stood before the press and said words no mayor in recent memory had dared to say. Accountability is not an attack on law enforcement. It's an act of respect for both the badge and the people it protects. Behind her stood Caleb Ward, not as a victim or a witness, but as an advisor. He had declined every interview, every book offer, every talk show invitation. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in follow-through. City Hall formed a civilian-led integrity task force chaired by a retired federal judge. For the first time, officers who reported misconduct were protected by a formal whistleblower clause. The police union pushed back at first, publicly loudly, but public trust had shifted. People wanted transparency. Neighborhood groups began holding forums where residents and officers sat in the same circle. No podium, no uniforms, just conversation. It was awkward, sometimes heated but real. Change, Caleb thought, didn't need to look graceful. It just needed to move. One morning, he visited the Boston Police Academy to speak to a group of recruits. They were young, nervous, eager to make a difference. He didn't lecture them about integrity. He told them a story. There was a time, he said, when I thought being right was enough. But it isn't. Doing right, that's the harder part. That's the part that defines you. The room was silent when he finished. A few took notes, most just stared. He hoped at least one of them would carry those words into the field where they mattered most. Officer Dana Whitaker's case moved quietly through internal affairs. The department stripped her of rank and placed her under investigation for perjury. But in an unexpected turn, she requested to meet with Caleb privately. Against advice, he agreed. They met in a small, sterile conference room at the Federal Building. She looked smaller than he remembered, not broken, just human. "I'm sorry," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "For all of it." He studied her for a long moment before responding. "You didn't just lie about me," he said. "You lied to yourself about what fear gives you permission to do." She nodded, tears welling, but never falling. "I want to make it right," she said. "Then start by telling the truth," he replied. She did. Her testimony in the Federal Review became a key piece of evidence in identifying systemic failures across multiple precincts. Redemption didn't erase her guilt, but it gave it purpose. By the end of the year, the Department of Justice released a national briefing naming Boston's reform model as a benchmark for urban accountability. Other cities, Seattle, Chicago, Atlanta, sent delegations to learn how Boston had rebuilt trust after a breach that could have shattered it. Caleb's role remained behind the scenes. He refused to become a symbol because he believed symbols could be dismissed. Systems couldn't. He spent weekends mentoring at-risk youth, many of them kids who'd grown up afraid of both sides of the badge. He started a scholarship in his father's name, the Isaiah Ward Fellowship, for students studying criminal justice and ethics. He called it a promise in progress. It wasn't just about education. It was about hope, stitched back together, one life at a time. On a quiet morning in late May, he stood on the Longfellow Bridge, watching the sun rise over the Charles River. The city was awake, but not loud, yet the kind of morning that made even steel and concrete seem gentle. In his hand was a letter handwritten folded twice. It was addressed to his younger self. He'd written it years earlier during a dark investigation, but he'd never mailed it. Now he read it softly to the wind. You will be tested. You will lose more than you think you can bear. But if you keep your faith in truth, you'll see that justice isn't a destination. It's a direction. Keep walking. As the light spread across the skyline, Caleb smiled faintly. The case had ended, but the work, the real work, had just begun. He wasn't naive enough to believe corruption had vanished, but he'd seen something rare, a city learn stumble and choose to stand up straighter. That was enough to keep him going. Behind him, church bells began to ring, their sound carried across the water. Caleb turned to leave his badge, glinting briefly in the morning sun, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of accountability. For the first time in years, the city felt honest. Not perfect, just honest. And maybe he thought that was the beginning of something America still needed to remember, that truth once spoken doesn't go away. It lingers, it rebuilds, and if given enough courage, it heals. When the echoes of the gavel faded and the cameras turned away, what lingered wasn't the sound of victory. It was the silence that follows truth finally being heard. Caleb Ward's story had begun as a moment of injustice and humiliation, a decorated FBI agent mistaken, or rather deliberately framed, as a criminal. But by the end, that story had become something much larger than one man's fight to clear his name. It was about a system forced to confront its reflection, about a city learning that power, without accountability, is corruption waiting to bloom. Through the long months of trial revelation and reform, Caleb never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His composure, his calm defiance in the face of lies became the very thing that broke the illusion of authority built on fear. When Officer Dana Whitaker lied under oath, she believed her badge would protect her. She believed the system she served would close ranks as it always had. What she never expected was that the man sitting across from her was the very embodiment of what true law enforcement was supposed to be: discipline, restraint, truth. By exposing her lies and the system that enabled them, Caleb did more than prove his innocence. He restored faith in the idea that justice still has a place in modern America. His story didn't end with her conviction or the applause of a courtroom. It extended into policies, new training programs, and conversations that echoed across precincts nationwide. Boston became a symbol of what's possible when courage meets evidence and when institutions are forced to rebuild from the ground up. But more than that, Caleb's story carries a timeless message for all of us. Truth doesn't need to shout it, only needs to stand firm. In a world where dishonesty often moves faster than integrity, where appearances can outweigh substance, his journey reminds us that character is not tested when things are easy, but when every incentive tells you to stay quiet. He could have walked away, filed a civil suit, disappeared into anonymity. Instead, he chose the harder path, the one that exposed corruption, protected others, and demanded transparency from those sworn to uphold it. That's the lesson worth carrying forward. Integrity isn't just a virtue, it's an act of resistance. Every time you speak up at work against something wrong, every time you choose empathy over anger, every time you document truth instead of letting lies take root, you're doing what Caleb Ward did. You're refusing to let the system of silence win. Justice doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts in everyday choices in how we treat others when no one's watching, and in our willingness to believe that honesty still matters. So as you reflect on this story, remember, this one person's courage can expose corruption, but collective courage can rebuild an entire culture. Let Caleb's example be a reminder that decency and truth are not outdated. They are the foundation of every real reform. If you were moved by this story, if you believe that truth and accountability still deserve a voice, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. Every voice matters, and every bit of support gives us the strength to keep telling stories that reveal truth, challenge injustice, and remind us all that integrity, no matter how tested, can still win.